Chapter 11. That same day, about the middle of the afternoon, Sybil unexpectedly appeared in my bungalow. She had, indeed, said she was going to come over for a chat with me so that we could talk alone and undisturbed, but I had imagined that she would give me some warning of her visit in advance. Even so, this flouting of the conventions caused me less surprise than her manner and appearance. She was cheerful, unruffled, and straightforward, and she had left her ghastly dark glasses behind. I apologized for not having any tea ready to offer her. The only time I drank it was in the morning, and then it came out of a thermos. I could easily get a bearer or bogo, too, I began. She interrupted me gaily. "You really prefer whiskey at this time of day, don't you?" she said. "Well, in my case, it's gin with a dash of lime." I still had a plentiful supply of liquor and soft drinks. I set them out on the veranda table and filled our glasses. Sybil said, "When I think of the frightful chore I inflicted on you your first evening here, simply because I just had to show off our china and silver." She gave a half-sad, half-ironical smile and added, "There are times when one grasps at any straw." I dared not look Sybil straight in the face. I was afraid of letting her see how surprising I found it that she should be so natural and lucid. She took a long drink of gin and went on, in a lower voice, "This is really wonderful. Too good, perhaps. Too easy. You know, the only people I see in the ordinary way are a few other colonials' wives, sometimes as far afield as Nairobi. My nerves are in a pretty shaky state already." Her eyes had become suffused with that lovely glow I had seen already. She looked at me and said, with remarkable simplicity and sincerity, "You have done us all an immense amount of good. Look at John and the child. You can see what a difference you've made to me." Sybil's candor was infectious. "Do you honestly believe there's any question of personal virtue about it?" I asked her. "It's very simple, really. All you need is somebody to discuss things with, who isn't involved in your family problems." "That's true enough," Sybil said. "We can't talk about the really important things to each other any longer." She looked down as she said this, her eyes on the ground, yet she did not hesitate before unburdening herself still further. It looked as though she wanted to take advantage of some absolutely final opportunity. She said, "It isn't because we don't love each other enough. On the contrary, it's because we love each other too much." She raised her head and looked straight at me. Resolution and desperate courage were written in every line of her face. The resolution to see herself and her environment as they really were, whatever the cost. The courage to put whatever she saw into words. "You must realize," she went on, "that our love is strong enough to make us suffer very deeply when we hurt each other in any way. We simply can't bear it. The result is that we all tend to transfer our guilt by picking on the other too." Sybil's features were puckered and lined in concentration, but her tranquil self-assurance remained intact. In an easy, level voice, she went on, "I say that John is a selfish brute who has no time for anything except his precious animals, and is totally indifferent to Patricia's future happiness. John says," and here Sybil gave a very sweet and lovely smile, "Oh, not often, and most tentatively. I've no doubt, but all the same, he does say that I'm an urban neurotic, that I don't understand a thing about the grandeur and mystery of the African bush, that through my snobbery and hysteria I'm liable to do some harm to Patricia. And Pat herself is convinced that I'd rather see her die in Nairobi than live happily here with her lion. If her father tries to make her see reason in the slightest degree, she assumes that his only motive is to back me up, and that makes her loathe us both impartially. And when poor John tries to deal tactfully with her on his own, I accuse them of ganging up on me." Sybil laid her bony hands before her on the table, fingers interlaced, and clasped them together so hard that the joints cracked. Her eyes still held mine steadily, but did not, it was plain, solicit any reply. Life would be easier if we could even keep our unjust anger kindled indefinitely, Sybil said. "At least I rather fancy it would. We would each feel we had right on our side, the pleasant sensation of outraged virtue, but we care for each other far too much not to see very quickly how stupid and ugly all these rows are, and then we wallow in pity instead. They're sorry for me, I'm sorry for them. I see what's happening every time. I don't suppose they catch on quite so often. It doesn't make any odds. None of us wants to be pitied." This time her lower lip had distinctly trembled, and her voice had risen a tone. I remained silent. There was nothing I could say. "The worst moment of all," Sybil went on doggedly, "is when you're past being torn to bits by either anger or pity, and you're just calm and clear-minded, because when you reach that point, you realize there's not a thing you can do about it." I could not bear to let her torture herself in this way without any protest on my part. "You can't be absolutely certain of that," I said. Sybil shook her head. "There's nothing to be done about it," she repeated, "especially when you have a group of people who are too devoted to live apart from each other, and yet aren't constituted in such a way that they can lead identical lives. It's nobody's fault, anyway. They don't realize this yet. Patricia, thank God, is still too young. John, luckily, is too simple. When they get the slightest reprieve, as it might be your visit, they believe everything will be all right again, but I know better." Sybil fell silent. As I stared at her haggard face and prematurely fading complexion, I experienced an emotion compounded of distress, compassion, and personal guilt. Almost as soon as I met this woman, I reflected, I made up my mind that she was vain, silly, and stubborn. Why? Because she still cherished a naive admiration for an old school friend with good-tasting clothes, and enjoyed entertaining me at a formal tea party. The most charitable feeling I had for her was a certain contemptuous pity, and all the time her agony of mind was due precisely to the keenness of her mind and her peculiarly delicate sensibilities. Sybil was staring out of the window toward Kilimanjaro. Suddenly she exclaimed, "They think I'm blind to all the beauty and poetry and savage splendor of the reserve. That's the thing I can't understand about them." Her voice cracked, and she pressed both hands to her head. "My God," she whispered, "if that was really true, would I suffer as I do now?" She turned back to face me, and there was sudden passion in her voice as she said, "There's a story I want to tell you. It happened at a time when I knew nothing of the terrors that haunt me now, and against which I remain powerless. I always used to accompany John on his trips. There was nothing I enjoyed more. Well, one day we were out in that area." She pointed toward the horizon on the eastern side of the great mountain, on a track that led across open country and petered out when it reached the forest. It was a very thick forest, of so dark a green that it looked almost black. You could see the peak of Kilimanjaro rising up behind it. It was here, just where bush and forest met, that we saw an elephant and a rhino facing each other head-on, horn against trunk. They had met on the forest verge, among the trees. Both were following the same track, and neither would give way to the other. John told me that this was what always happened. They're the two most powerful animals alive, you see. It was a question of pride. These two fought to the death before our very eyes, and the dark wall of greenery and the mountain peak formed a backdrop behind them. The elephant was victorious, as always, John said. In the end, he heaved the rhino over on its back with one gigantic heave of his huge shoulder and trampled it to death. But his own entrails were hanging out of his belly, and John had to shoot him when it was all over. Do you know, I found myself wishing that fight could go on forever. It summed up all the power and ferocity that the world has ever known, from the beginning to the end of time. I was no longer just any weak, fearful woman. I had become a part of what I saw. Sybil paused, out of breath. After a moment, she said, "Could I have another gin, please?" She drank it at one gulp and went on. If I had not experienced this emotion myself at its deepest level, could I have even begun to understand what the bush and the wild creatures that inhabit it mean to a man like John? And supposing I hadn't experienced it, don't you believe that I would somehow have argued or bullied him into living in Nairobi? He would have done that for me, you know, poor darling John. The infinite quality of her love showed for an instant through those smiling eyes. John and I will always manage somehow, Sybil went on quickly. That isn't what I wanted to talk to you about." She paused again for a moment, as though gathering her strength, and then said, violently and emphatically, "But it's vital that Patricia should be taken away from this place. Really vital. Believe me. Look, you can see I'm not a lunatic yet. I know what I'm saying, and I've had time to do some hard, clear thinking during this lull in hostilities. Whether she goes to school or a private family, to Nairobi or Europe, is of secondary importance. But the child must leave here, and without delay. Soon it will be too late. Oh, I'm not worrying about her education or manners. I can still take care of that side of it. It's her personal safety I'm concerned with. It's a matter of life and death, and frankly, I'm scared." "What's worrying you in particular?" I asked. "King. The animals." "Oh, how the hell should I know?" Sybil snapped. "It's the whole setup here. The child's highly strung and temperamental at the best of times. The climate and environment and atmosphere of the place simply make things worse. It can't go on like this. There's bound to be real trouble sooner or later." My thoughts turned to Orunga. Sybil was unaware of his existence, but she at once sensed that I shared her fears. She said firmly, "You've got Patricia's entire confidence. Do the impossible. Make her see reason." Sybil got to her feet and added, "I'm relying on you." Then she walked slowly down the veranda steps, back to the loneliness and love which had closed round herself, her husband, and her child, like the jaws of a trap. It was early evening when Patricia came running over to my bungalow, her smooth, sunburned cheeks flushed with pleasure. King, it appeared, had shown even greater affection to her than usual, and Patricia was convinced that this was his way of apologizing for the rudeness and hostility of his 2 wives. I let Patricia prattle on till she was finished, but just as she was saying goodbye, I remarked, "I shall have to be leaving here soon. You know that, don't you?" She suddenly looked very miserable. In a quiet voice she said, "I know only too well. That's just life, I suppose." "You wouldn't like to come on a trip to France with me, would you?" "For how long?" Patricia asked. "Oh, long enough to visit all the big shops and the best theaters. Long enough to make some friends of your own age." Her childish face, so trusting and affectionate only a brief instant ago, abruptly froze. She looked fierce, alien, withdrawn. "You talk just like Mummy," she exclaimed. "Whose friend are you, mine or hers?" I remembered Sybil's remarks about the instinctive use of unfair accusations to stifle one's own sense of suffering. I said to Patricia, "There has never been any choice as far as I'm concerned. I have always been on your side." But she still stared angrily at me. "So you think it'd be better for me to leave here too?" she cried. I made no reply. Patricia's lips were white and drawn. "I shall never leave the reserve," she said. "Never. If they try and make me go, I'll run away and hide in the native village, or with the Maasai, or perhaps I'll go to King and make friends with his wives and look after his cubs. I had great trouble in making my peace with Patricia. When it was finally accomplished, she said, with all her old charm, "You're not a bad sort at heart. I know perfectly well why you want to take me away. You're afraid for me." Then she shrugged her slight shoulders and added, "But heavens, what are you scared of?" Chapter 12. I learned the news from Bogo. The Maasai patriarch, Okalu, was dead. The clan had just chosen an equally wise, tough old warrior as his successor. Bogo even knew his name, Wainana. He also knew that there would be a feast at the Manyata that same day to celebrate the occasion. I thanked my driver for passing this information on to me so promptly, but Bogo still had something to say and clearly found it embarrassing. He stood there fiddling with the large silver buttons on his uniform, while the lines and wrinkles of his old face worked desperately. I pretended to notice nothing. Finally, Bogo said, his eyes fixed on the square toes of his clumsy yellowish shoes, "Sa, I knows you like to go to this feast. You always interested in these things." "That's quite true. What of it?" Bogo looked miserably up at me and said, in a quick, breathless rush of words, "These Maasai, they go mad when they dancing. They always carry their spears, always remembering old wars. They fight against us, Kikuyu. Sa, would be great kindness if you would go to Manyata, all same, car with Boss Warden, ask him drive you." "I'd be glad to," I said, "but are you sure he's—" For the first time in all our travels together, Bogo forgot himself enough to interrupt me. "He goin', sa, he goin'." Bogo protested. "The Maasai, they done invite him. Wainana and him makin' talk now, down village." From my bungalow to the native village was a 5 minutes walk at the outside. I always went there on foot, but this time Bogo insisted on driving me. He wanted no doubt to demonstrate his gratitude to me, but he was also anxious to make quite sure as soon as possible that he would not be needed for the trip to the Manyata. I found Bullet deep in conversation with a slightly younger and less severe-looking Maasai than Okalu, but though his general appearance was mild enough, this impression of bonhomie was bellied by a pair of sharp and cunning eyes. The lobes of his ears, by a slow and patient process, had been stretched away from the cartilage and now hung down on his shoulders. He was speaking Swahili. "I see your information is well up to date," Bullet said to me. "The bush telegraph in this reserve functions wonderfully well, that's obvious." I asked if he was going, and could take me with him. "Of course I'm going. Got to. Must be polite. They're kicking off about midday. We'll pick you up a little before that." I was just finishing a cold lunch in the bungalow when Bullet came in search of me. Under the auburn thatch, his face bore an expression of gleeful and childish mystery. I understood why, when I saw not only Patricia in the Land Rover, but Sybil too. "You see how much better I am these days," she said, smiling at my obvious astonishment. "I'm even getting back my taste for local color." She lifted Patricia onto her knees so as to make room for me in the front of the vehicle. As we drove off to pick up 3 rangers from the village, it struck me that Sybil knew nothing as yet of the result of my discussion with Patricia. I asked Bullet if he was taking the rangers just to be on the safe side. When we're the guest of the Maasai, he queried, "You must be joking." "A guard of honor for you, then." "More a mark of respect to them," Bullet said. He looked at me over Patricia's head and added, winking both eyes in turn, exactly as she sometimes did, "It flatters their dignity." My mind went back to our first meeting. I remembered Bullet's anger and contempt at my use of this word with reference to Bogo. Those winks were a good measure of the distance our friendship had developed since then. Okalu was a real aristocrat, I said. "And he died like one," said Bullet. "Infection by cow dung of a wound made by the claws of a lion. What more could a true Maasai chief desire?" Sybil said to me, "John is one of the very few white men who have actually seen the Moraines attack a lion." Because his wife was among the passengers, Bullet had chosen to drive much slower than usual, and so, while open bush gave place to wooded scrub, and Kilimanjaro appeared and vanished with each fresh twist of the track, he had ample leisure to describe, for my benefit, one of those fabulous ritual combats which till very recent times had decimated lions and Maasai alike. One fine morning, about dawn, 10 or a dozen young men would leave the manyatta and make for the den of a lion, which they had probably spent much time and ingenuity in tracking down earlier. Apart from their tall mitres of plaited hair, shining now with the grease, herbal juices, and clay that had been worked into them, they would be naked. The only other adornments they had were the manes of lions killed by the clan elders when they had been moraines themselves. These they wore bound round their foreheads. The only attacking weapons they carried were spears and machetes. Their only protection was a light shield. Thus armed, they encircled the den, creeping and gliding through the undergrowth like snakes. When the ring was close and continuous enough to make it certain that wherever the lion broke cover, a moraine would block his path, all the warriors sprang to their feet, yelling and whooping and beating on their leather shields with the butts of the iron-tipped spears. The lion would show himself, and a shower of spears bury themselves in his body. Then he would charge to his death. Bullet said, "I don't know any man who, put in the place of those moraines, wouldn't have flinched back at least a foot, or ducked his head an inch or so. Even when you've got a heavy caliber rifle in your hands, you tend to squeeze yourself into the smallest possible space when a lion comes at you under these circumstances. But these moraines actually rushed forward to meet the charging beast, though he launched himself against them with all the fury and sheer power at his command. Their war cries were so loud and strident that not even the lion's roars could drown them. The circle drew closer and closer. In order to break out to freedom, the lion must smash one link in this fragile chain of human bone and muscle, knock it out, maul it, rip it to shreds. The moraine, who found himself in the direct line of this murderous charge, and took the full furious shock on his shield, usually collapsed at once, yet neither jaws nor claws impaired his courage. He grappled fiercely with the lion, while all his fellow warriors swarmed into the attack, thrusting their spears through the beast's ribs and throat, or slashing repeatedly at it with their machetes. First one moraine, then a second, perhaps a third, would reel back with deep, cruel claw marks scored in their throats or bellies, with a shoulder blade or vertebrae broken. Yet they felt no pain. Their frenetic condition rendered them insensible to physical wounds, and they returned to the assault, helping their comrades all they could. There were always enough survivors to bring this mad hunt to its conclusion with the slaughter and dismemberment of the lion. This done, the visitors would return to the manyatta, their black skin all bedabbled with the lion's blood, and their own, and bits of the mane fluttering from their spear points. That's what Okalu died of, Bullet concluded, after 50 years, too, like an old soldier who nurses a war wound for half a century. Have you ever known a moraine to venture out against a lion single-handed? Patricia asked her father. I've certainly never heard of such a thing, Bullet said. They may be crazy, but at least they leave themselves some chance of survival. At this moment we emerged on the wide stretch of open country where the manyatta lay. The slight eminence on which it had been built was clearly visible in the middle distance. Bullet drove fast over this easy terrain, and we soon reached the hill crowned by that curious oval ant hill, which served as a habitation for a whole Maasai clan. Then Patricia said to me, "We might as well stay here, you and me, and stroll around for a bit. There's always a lot of chatter and boring nonsense before the feast begins. It's much more fun to arrive when things are well underway." I glanced at Sybil and Bullet, soliciting their approval. "She's not far off the mark at that," Sybil said with a smile. Bullet burst out laughing and added, "Yes, she's quite an old hand at this sort of caper." I got out of the car. Before Patricia slid down off her mother's knees, she kissed her warmly. Over the top of Patricia's head, Sybil's eyes sought mine. I gathered from their expression that Sybil believed I had succeeded in persuading Patricia to change her way of life, but there was no time to disillusion her, even by some sort of sign. Patricia had caught me by the hand and was dragging me away. When she saw that the Land Rover was on its way up the gentle slope that led to the manyatta, Patricia said to me, I can tell you the truth. I'm turning up late to give the Maasai a surprise. They're dying to take a look at me. I'm pretty sure of that. You can bet anything. You, like that Arunga, has told them about King. They'll think I'm not coming, and then, quite unexpectedly, there I'll be. See what I mean? Patricia shook with silent laughter, and winked at me. Then, as we skirted round the foot of the little hill, she led me on, right up to the thorny corral, where the cattle were penned. We're nicely sheltered here, she said. We can stretch our legs, and pass the time comfortably. I followed Patricia's example, but I lacked the natural ability she had of closing down her mind at the same time as she shut her eyes, nor could I stand the full blaze of the tropical sun shining down on me. The ground was so baking hot that it burned my body right through the layers of dry grass and clothing which lay between. No doubt because of this disability, I was the first to notice a most unpleasant smell in the air. It was both fetid and sweetish. It did not emanate from the cow's enclosure, as I had first supposed, but from a screen-like group of bushes some little distance off. I remarked on it to Patricia. I know, she said idly. It must be an animal's carcass somewhere. She shut her eyes again, only to open them almost at once, and sit up on one elbow. From the same clump of bushes there had come a faint moaning sound. For all its weakness, there could be no doubt it emanated from a human throat. It wavered, broke off, began once more, and then fell silent again. Patricia turned her head and stared up at the hilltop. A savage chant accompanied by rhythmic clapping now echoed out from the manyatta. They've begun the feast, Patricia said. That's all they'll be paying any attention to. We can slip across to those bushes without any risk of being seen. The nearer we came, the stronger the stench. There was a horrible cloying sweetness about it. A decaying carcass doesn't smell like that, Patricia muttered. In fact, the stink came not from a dead animal, but a dying man, and the man was Alkalu. He could no longer recognize anybody. The gangrene had done its dreadful work, and it was this that produced the foul smell infesting the air of the bush. But he was still alive. Long spasms of shuddering shock his emaciated limbs, and momentarily shifted the swarms of flies that had settled on his scarred and rotting flesh. The rasping repetitive note that heralds the death rattle burst from his throat. But what does this mean? I asked in astonishment. Everyone firmly believes he's dead. But he is dead, Patricia pointed out. He can't live any more, can he? There was not a trace of emotion in her voice, and her big eyes stared quite tranquilly at Alkalu. But surely, I said, his family could have taken care of him, or at least kept him with them till the end. Not the Maasai, Patricia said. Once again there appeared on her face that condescending expression which she assumed when compelled to explain what she considered perfectly natural and self-evident notions. When a man or woman dies in the manyatta, she told me, his spirit stays there and causes untold harm to the whole clan. The only remedy is to burn the manyatta and move on elsewhere, to avoid unnecessary trouble. The dying person is taken outside and abandoned somewhere in the bush, like this old fellow. The child's voice betrayed neither pity nor fear, where I wondered, and in what way had Patricia found time and opportunity to learn the meaning of death? He won't even feel any more pain soon, Patricia went on. That's when the vultures and wild dogs will begin to gather. On the little hilltop, the frenzied shouting redoubled. Time to go, Patricia exclaimed. Come on. But as she tried to dart away, I held her back by one arm. Wait a moment, I said. It looks to me as if Okalu is trying to say something. The young girl listened carefully for a moment, then shrugged. He just keeps repeating the same word. Lion, lion, lion. Then she set off, running toward the manyatta, and I followed more slowly, still obsessed by Okalu's dying delirium. Through the old man's sick dreams, there stalked the beast, which he had killed long ago as a murrain, and which today, 50 years afterward, was taking its revenge. Chapter 13. I did not arrive in time to observe the effects of Patricia's stratagem, but, in a manner of speaking, I was able to hear it. When I had got about halfway up the hill, the tremendous row going on in the manyatta suddenly stopped dead. The ensuing silence had a quality of sheer astonishment about it. An eloquent tribute by the Maasai to this little white girl who had a lion under her control. Their silent homage did not last long, however. By the time I reached the thorny zareba surrounding the manyatta, festivities were in full swing once more, and the noise had redoubled in volume. When I got inside and could see what was going on, the total effect was overwhelming. A savage, garish kaleidoscope of sound and color and rhythmic movement. Both the setting and the performers were something out of this world. The manyatta looked exactly like a long, brown, ringed caterpillar, looping back on itself. It was low and arched, and roofed over with one continuous layer of baked mud. This mud roof was supported at intervals by the overarching branches I had seen a day or so ago, all dripping with wet cow dung. In the space enclosed by this curling caterpillar, the whole clan was assembled. All of them, with the exception of a dozen or so young men who had a specially reserved place in the center of the plateau, were crowded against the cracked wall of the manyatta, thus forming a kind of outer circle. The women and girls were dressed up in all their finery. They had on cotton dresses, dyed in bright, crude colors. Their necks, wrists, and ankles were loaded with silver bracelets, and they wore ornaments of lava or copper. The material for these came from dry stream beds and the tiny extinct volcanoes that were dotted about all over the bush. The older women had earlobes, like long loops of fleshy string, which hung down to their shoulders and were weighted with pieces of wood or iron or tightly rolled cloth. They were completely detached from the cartilage, and the women swung them with great dignity as they walked. The only decorations the men carried were their spears, with the exception, that is, of the young men, who were circling round the center of the open space, one behind the other. Each of these bore, in addition to his spear, a long, sword-like machete, and a stout cowhide shield, painted in glaring colors, and decorated with outlandish symbols. They all had different ornaments as well, ostrich plumes nodding above their foreheads, or ivory earrings, or necklaces of glass beads. But only the three Moraines, who led the procession, wore their hair long and dressed. The others, who had either passed the privileged age or not yet attained it, had their heads shaven like the rest of the tribe. The Moraines, too, were alone in wearing those most coveted of all trophies in Maasai eyes, the teeth, claws, or skin of a lion, and it was Orunga, the tallest and most striking of them all, who now headed this winding procession, with the lion's royal mane, a halo about his clay-daubed, plaited top-knot. All these weapons and ornaments quivered and jangled and shook in time with the rhythmic motions of their owners' dark, vigorous, youthful bodies. The drape of cloth flung over one shoulder concealed none of their physical attributes. On they went, one behind the other, round and round, moving faster the whole time, and twisting their bodies into increasingly grotesque contortions. It was neither a march nor a dance in the strict sense, so much as a circular sequence of convulsive leaps and bounds and sudden rushes that stopped almost before they had begun. There were no formal rules or patterns. Each participant was his own master, or rather, adept at releasing his body into a trance-like state which appeared to disassociate every limb from any central nervous control. Every muscle and joint and ligament, each individual toe bone and finger bone, behaved as though they had separate individual existences and were all convulsed by their own private St. Vitus's dance. The thick, hoarse animal sounds that burst from their chests and throats and kept time with the rhythms of their twitching limbs could hardly be classified as either speech or chant. What emerged was a kind of endless shout, which wavered, broke off short, began again, died down, and surged up once more in delirious ecstasy. Each member of the troupe had his own version of it, modified according to personal whim. One made it sound happy, another turned it into a lament, a third gave it a plaintive, wistful note, and a fourth made a yell of triumph out of it. Yet there was some indefinable kind of unity here, permeating not only these formless, uncontrolled, disordered movements, but also the voices, individual, uncadenced, which accompanied them. Through them all ran a certain wild, primitive harmony. There was no rational pattern controlling it. It came from the guts, and belonged to a side of the human makeup over which disciplined gestures and concerted rhythms had absolutely no control. It sprang from the enfevered pulsing of the blood, from man's defiance of destiny, from the mad delirium of battle and sexual passion, from what might be termed a collective tribal ecstasy. The men and women who lined the inner wall of the manyatta experienced its seductive power too. They shouted and clapped their hands, acting simultaneously as orchestra, chorus, and audience, and though they remained motionless, one could feel that they were caught up and carried away by the convulsive stamping and writhing of the young warriors, and through their meditation delivered over to the same inner demons. As for the young men themselves, their black, mask-like faces possessed an almost funeral beauty. These stiffly carved features were like the profiles on some ancient Egyptian tomb, and the finest of them all was Orunga, beneath the lion's mane and the great plaited mass of coppery hair. His face conveyed a unique impression of beauty and mystery and terrifying fierceness. When I succeeded in detaching my attention from the protagonist in the tableau, their stage decor, the low wall of the manyatta, their backdrop mile upon mile of sun-drenched sky and bush, I spotted Bullet and Sybil. They were sitting on a square sheet of material like that the Maasai used for their dress. Between them was Patricia, kneeling to get a better view. I wormed my way round to them from behind. "What are they saying?" I asked Patricia. Without moving, she whispered, "They're telling the story of Okalu's great hunt when he was young. The teeth and claws and mane belong to the lion that he killed." "How far have they got?" "They've just got the lion encircled," Patricia muttered impatiently. "Now be quiet and let me listen." Then Sybil, keeping one eye on her daughter's eager, concentrated face, leaned quietly across to me and murmured, "Well, has she agreed to leave?" "I couldn't do a thing with her," I said in a low voice. Sybil's expression did not change in the slightest degree, but mechanically she took her dark glasses out of a pocket and put them on. It is true that the sun was beating down vertically now on the open space behind the manyatta. With her eyes thus carefully camouflaged, she watched Patricia with the closest attention. Patricia was paying no attention to us whatsoever. She belonged entirely to her savage surroundings. Minute by minute, the atmosphere heightened toward a climax of madness and possession. The stamping of feet that shook the ground beneath us now became quicker and quicker in tempo. The circle traced by the procession grew increasingly haphazard. Limbs trembled more intensely. Bodies and buttocks shimmied with greater abandon. Knees and ankles knocked together. Shoulders and bellies vibrated. But the mainspring of these uncoordinated bodies appeared to reside in their long, black, sinuous, muscular necks. At one moment, they would be sunk in on themselves, almost invisible. At the next, they would dart out and up, turning and twisting like snakes. Double-jointed, seemingly invertebrate, they were involved in a ceremonial dance that might have been designed for their benefit alone, and the yelling and shouting made tendons and veins stand out on them like great creepers on a tree trunk. The men and women ranged in front of the Manyatta wall took up these cries, redoubled and multiplied them, though they still did not budge from where they stood. Their own necks now began to weave back and forth in a quick, even sinuous motion. Then abruptly, all the warriors sprang into the air simultaneously, spears and swords outstretched, brandishing their shields. There came the metallic thwack of weapons being banged against thick cowhide. I leaned over Bullet's shoulder. He was sitting in front of me, and asked if it was the end of the hunt, the death of the lion, which they were now miming. He nodded without turning his head. Then I saw that the muscles round his heavy neck were twitching, and became aware that strange forces were tugging hard at my own. Even we were affected by the frenzy of the Maasai. I looked at Patricia. She knelt there, stiff and erect, knees close together. Her face was tranquil enough, but her lips were moving rapidly. She was repeating to herself the words howled by the warriors, and then repeated in chorus by the remainder of the clan. Only Sybil, her eyes still hidden behind their smoked lenses, remained untouched by the strong magic which this collective furor generated. It was true that her cheeks and the corners of her mouth had begun to pucker and twitch, as though with some sort of nervous tic. This was a symptom I recognized. It heralded a real emotional crisis. Yet the events of the past few days had, I imagined, cured Sybil's troubles in this field. I thought of all she had told me, out there on my veranda, and of the cool, clear intelligence which had then inspired her. I thought for a moment of recalling her own words on that occasion. Such a reminder might help her to get control of her nerves again, but it was plainly impossible. I could no more have spoken than she could have heard me out. The procession of warriors was still intoning its confused and confusing chant, but these pants and grunts, torn from sweat-streaked, heaving chest, had lost all human characteristics. Spears and swords still hammered at cowhide shields. Those black necks now resembled furious, writhing snakes. Suddenly, a group of little girls, 2, 3, up to 10 in all, jumped up briskly from their places in the audience and formed a second procession. This file was an exact duplicate of that led by the tranced, hypnotic warriors, and the girls set themselves to reproduce all the gestures of this trance from head to toe. Their stick-like limbs and narrow buttocks and skinny shoulders began to shudder and twitch and jump. They flung themselves into whole exhausting, savage ritual that had produced so extraordinary a state of disassociation in the young men. But when the girls began to howl and shriek, foam formed at the corners of their mouths, and their eyes turned up till only the whites showed. I felt Sybil's nails digging into my palm. She sat bolt upright and said, "I thought I could take it, but I can't. It's too revolting for words. To think that those girls are already married to those crazy lunatics." Almost in a scream she added, "Ask John if that isn't true. Go on, ask him." "Oh, it's true enough," Bullet said. without turning round, but they aren't really married till they've graduated from the status of moraine, so to speak. Up till then, they merely have concubines. Suddenly, Patricia said, in clipped, harsh, barely recognizable tones, "For heaven's sake, do stop talking. This is the grand climax. The Moraines have returned to the Monjata with their trophies from the lion. The two parallel files were weaving in and out, opening and shutting their ranks." "Look at Patricia," Sybil whispered. "It's horrible." Patricia was still on her knees, but her body and shoulders and neck above all, that white and delicate young neck of hers, were beginning to shudder and heave and lose their normal coordination. "John! John!" cried Sybil. But Bullet made no reply. At this precise moment, Orunga, with his followers crowding behind him, came over to where we sat and began to harangue Bullet, waving his spear to point each remark. Despite myself, I turned and glanced at the Rangers. They were leaning on their rifles and laughing heartily. Bullet looked questioningly at Wainana, who was standing beside him. The new chief of the clan translated the Moraine's words into Swahili. He spoke slowly and deliberately, and Sybil understood the gist of his remarks. "John," she gasped, "he wants to have Patricia as his wife." Bullet got lazily to his feet. He put one arm around Sybil's shoulders and said to her in a very gentle voice, "Don't let it worry you, darling. It isn't an insult. On the contrary, it's a great honor. Orunga is their finest moraine." "What is your reply going to be?" Sybil demanded. Her lips were pale, and she found some difficulty in getting the words out. "Oh, that Orunga isn't a full-grown man yet, and that we'll think about it later, since they're leaving the reserve at the end of this week." He turned to Wainana and spoke to him in Swahili. Wainana passed the message on to Orunga. Despite the horrible heat, Sybil was now actually shivering. In a wavering, near-hysterical voice, she said to Patricia, "Get up. Don't stay on your knees in front of a savage." Patricia did as she was told. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes were weary. She was clearly waiting for something else. Orunga gave her a long, mad stare, tore the lion's mane from his head, fixed it high on his spear point, and made what looked like a frenzied appeal to heaven. Then his neck sank on his shoulders, rose again, and sent an odd undulation running down the whole length of his spinal column. His limbs went soft, as though they had been filleted. His pelvis might have been broken to look at him, and all his joints dislocated. He set off round the circle once more, the other warriors behind him, all twisting their bodies to the same rhythm as before. Beside them, the little girls went through the same evolutions and underwent similar convulsions. Their lips were still flecked with foam, and their eyeballs still inverted. Patricia made a movement as if to join them. Sybil held on to her hand with both hands. "For God's sake, John," she said, let's get out of here right away, or I'll be sick. Bullet said, "All right, darling, you go. I've got to stay a little longer. It would be a frightful insult if I didn't. You've got to look at it from their point of view. They have their dignity after all." This time there was not a trace of irony or malicious implication in his use of the word. "Please go back with Sybil and Pat," he said to me. "A ranger can drive you, and bring the Land Rover back for me afterward." When we had left the manada far behind us, we could still hear the uproar going on. This merely served to accentuate the silence in the car. To break it, I asked Patricia whether the festivities would go on for long. "All day and all night," Patricia said. Sybil had her daughter on her knees again. She was breathing deeply, as though she had just recovered from a fainting fit. She bent down over Patricia's smooth, cropped head and said, "What was the Moraine shouting about right at the end?" "I couldn't make that bit out, Mummy," Patricia said sweetly. "Anyway, it doesn't matter, does it?" I was certain she was lying, and I believe I knew the reason. Chapter 14. I had to wait till the following day before I saw Patricia again, and the morning was nearly over before she turned up at my bungalow. This time she did not bring either the gazelle or the little monkey with her, yet she did not come from the direction of the water hole, and had not been out among the animals. There was not so much as a speck of mud or damp clay on her small bush shoes, and the washed-out pastel blue overalls she was wearing remained innocent of stains or creases. "I stayed at home with Mummy all morning," she said immediately, as though she felt the need to apologize for having neglected me. "We got through a lot of work and talked everything over. She's all right now, quite all right." Patricia's face was the epitome of tranquility and sweet childishness. She gave me her most affectionately mischievous smile and said, "Mummy's given me permission to have lunch with you." "That's wonderful. I'm afraid I've only got cold food, though." "I reckoned you would," she said. "Good. That means we can eat more quickly." "You're in a hurry then, are you?" I inquired. But she did not answer my question. Instead she said, "Let me get it ready for you. Just show me where your stores are." In the kitchen we found some cans of biscuits, some sardines, and corned beef, a hunk of hard cheese, and some butter. Patricia, eyebrows knitted in concentration and tongue protruding slightly, sorted out all this food into platefuls, sprinkled the result with salt, mustard, and pepper, and carried the plates out to the veranda table. Her face was happy and serious at once. We were just finishing our meal when Bogo came in to get lunch ready for me. Kihoro was with him. "Excellent," Patricia said. "We'll be off now." "Where to?" I asked. "King's Tree." "So early?" "You never know," Patricia said. Her big dark eyes stared straight into mine. There was about them that look of innocence and mullishness, which was her way of telling me it was no earthly use my asking for explanations. We followed our usual route along the main road and then turned off on the track that led to the spot where Patricia and King had their meeting place. Bogo, again as usual, stopped the car shortly after the beginning of this track, and Kehoro pretended he was staying with the driver, as he always did. I had not exchanged a single word with Patricia during the journey, and this silence remained unbroken till we reached the shade of the tree itself. King was not there. You see how it is, I said. I don't mind. It's more pleasant waiting here. She stretched herself out comfortably at the foot of the tree. Oh, it's good here, she said, breathing deeply, and there's a wonderful scent in the air. I was not sure whether she was referring to the dry, harsh, slightly bitter perfume of the bush, or the scent beyond the range of my nostrils that the great lion had left clinging to the grass where he had rested. Yes, Patricia repeated drowsily. It's really good here. Her patience seemed quite inexhaustible, and she was sublimely confident that it would be rewarded in the end. A big antelope came bounding casually past, saw us behind the tree, swerved away in an enormous circle, and vanished over the horizon at top speed. Patricia burst out laughing. He thought we were king, she exclaimed. Then she shut her eyes and said, dreamily, there was something about him, the size especially, that made him look rather like an animal we never see in this reserve. She sat up abruptly, leaning on one elbow, and went on in a lively fashion. I never actually met this special antelope, but I've seen photos of it, and my parents talked about it a lot. It was caught alive as a very small baby by a friend of my father's in Uganda. He gave it to Mummy as a wedding present. I'm not sure what exact species this antelope belonged to. We used to refer to it as the Uganda cob. Mummy took it out to a farm near Lake Naivasha, which my father had rented after his marriage. He spent a year trying to be a planter before he came to the reserve, just to please Mummy. Patricia's right arm was pillowing her head. Now she gave a shrug of the same shoulder and said, Can you imagine my father as a planter where there were hippos and great apes and wild duck about the place? He spent all his time observing the hippos, having fun and games with the monkeys, and shooting the ducks. Which reminds me, do you know what he did with the Uganda cob? He trained that antelope as a retriever. It used to go out and pick up wounded birds from swamps and places like that. It got craftier than a gun dog after a while. You ask him about it, Patricia's excitement abruptly evaporated, and her voice changed. When we get back. She lay back again and repeated in a whisper, when we get back. What vision was it she saw behind those lowered eyelids that could so transform her childish face into this passionate, enigmatic mask? I felt I was sure that I knew, yet I was afraid even to think of the idea, let alone to speak it out loud. I sat down beside Patricia. She opened her eyes, and they were gentle and innocent. Mummy tried to get me to go back to school again, she said. She was so miserable, and I do love her so much. She just can't understand. I reflected, as she said this, that in fact Sybil understood all too well. Anyway, I promised I would, but later. She winked one eye at me. A very long time later, if you see what I mean. But it made Mummy happy, and I can't think of anything I'd rather have than that. With a vague, sweeping gesture, Patricia embraced the bush, the thorny jungle, and the snowy summit of Kilimanjaro. She got up, on her knees, in order to have her eyes level with mine. Is it humanly possible to leave all that? She demanded. I turned my head away. I found myself agreeing with her feelings, only too vehemently. I'm so happy here, so utterly happy, Patricia whispered, and there was an air of absolute conviction in the way she said it. My father knows that only too well. The blood suddenly flushed up into her brown cheeks. How could I spend my whole time cooped up in some school and never see this place? It was a cry from the heart, and what would he do without me? We get on so wonderfully together. He's stronger than anyone in the world, and he does anything I tell him. Patricia laughed silently. And what about Kahoro? Do you suppose I could take him with me? She shook her head. Mummy spends all her time talking about the lovely toys children have in big towns. Toys indeed. Patricia seemed to be about to repeat this derisive term for emphasis, but the words suddenly died on her lips as a tawny shape, haloed with its mane, appeared in the distance and moved through the tall grasses toward us. King was taking his time. He clearly thought he was early. Every step he took emphasized the splendid strength of his shoulders, the royal majesty of his gait. He was not looking around him. He could not even be bothered to sniff the wind. Why should he? It was not his time of day for hunting, and he had no need to worry about other animals, rather than the reverse. Man, of course, was his friend, inside the reserve. So the great lion came on, proud and nonchalant. If his tail occasionally switched against his flank, it was only to get rid of some troublesome flies. Patricia held her breath and watched him. It was as though she were seeing him for the first time, and feared to break the spell. Sunlight gleamed back from King's golden eyes. The little girl could control herself no longer, and uttered the long, haunting call I had already heard. King's mane bristled, and the joyous roar, which was his way of laughing, now rolled out across the savannah. In 3 enormous, effortless bounds, he reached us. He licked Patricia's face, and then stretched out his big muzzle to me. As I scratched him between the eyes, it struck me, more forcibly than ever, that the one he kept half closed, a mere slit of an eye, was giving me a friendly wink. Then King lay down on his side and lifted up one of his front paws, so that Pat could wriggle into her usual place beside him. But Patricia was having none of it. She ignored the gesture. Her mood, indeed her entire bearing, had suddenly taken an extremely odd turn. Till that moment she had been serene and tender and quite oblivious of time, but as soon as King arrived, she fell victim to a frantic, gnawing impatience, tinged with plain fury. She darted out from the cover of the tree, and scanned the bush in every direction, shading her eyes with one hand. Then she came back, and squatted down on her heels between me and the lion. After a moment she got up, and sat down again. I tried to say something, but she motioned to me to keep quiet. King lay there, with his head resting on the grass, and watched Patricia. Occasionally, he would give her an affectionate sort of growl. There he was, beneath their own tree, with Patricia beside him, and yet she seemed not to notice his presence. He couldn't understand it. Very delicately, he stretched out one paw and patted Patricia's shoulder. She was staring out toward the horizon. When King touched her, she started with surprise and pushed his paw away. The lion quivered with pleasure. At last, it seemed, their game was beginning. He patted Patricia again, a little harder. This time she not only pushed him away, but hit him with real violence. "Keep quiet, you idiot," she shouted savagely. King backed away slowly and lay down on his belly. His eyes had narrowed to mere yellow lines behind drooping lids. He looked like a sphinx, but his gaze was still fixed questioningly on Patricia. He had never known her to behave like this before. Tentatively, he moved his head forward and very, very gently licked her cheek. She doubled up her fist and smashed it into his nose. King shook his great mane once, a quick, puzzled flick, and then, without uttering a sound, he got up, lowered his head, turned away from us, and took a step forward as if to go. "Oh, no, you don't," Patricia exclaimed. "You're not going to leave me now. Not today." She ran up behind King, grabbed hold of his mane, and pulled as hard as she could. Then she laid her hot little cheek against the lion's nostrils, and King purred happily again, and once more curled up on his side. His eyes regained their golden clarity and tranquility. Patricia stretched herself out at his side, but her eyes still scanned the distant edge of the scrub. The sound of a car starting up reached us, and instinctively I got to my feet. "Don't move," said Patricia, with some irritation. "Your half-witted black driver must have got scared of being alone all this time." Her face puckered as she struggled with some thought that was bothering her. She muttered, "But he isn't alone, is he? He's got Kahoro with him." I could have told her then that in fact the old tracker was hidden somewhere near us, rifle at the ready, but I had been forbidden to warn her of his presence. A few moments passed in silence, and then at last there emerged from a distant clump of bushes the man whom Patricia had awaited with such fierce impatience. Ever since we had left the manyatta, I had known he would come, and yet I scarcely recognized the strange figure that now appeared before me. It seemed to have sprung from the dark, primeval womb of time. At arm's length, Before him, the warrior held a gigantic shield, and high above his head, and its coppery clay-smeared tower of hair, there hung from his spear point the mane of a royal lion, armed and adorned according to immemorial tribal custom. Urunga the Moraine had come to face that great ordeal which brings a Maasai to full manhood, and by so doing to win Patricia. In one respect, indeed, he was more ardent and courageous than his ancestors, because he came alone. Patricia and King sprang to their feet simultaneously. The lion had been familiar with Patricia's every scent and movement since his earliest days, and now, by the reactions of this fragile, childish body at his side, he knew that something unusual, dangerous, and hostile was approaching them. Patricia and King stood side by side, she with one hand on his mane, he with his jaws half open, the terrible incisors exposed, and watched as the Maasai warrior came nearer and nearer. I had instinctively drawn back and flattened myself against the trunk of the tree. I am convinced this was not mere cowardice on my part. I should have no scruples about saying so if it had been. All my experience in the reserve, all that Patricia had taught me, was now culminating in this one climatic moment, and such emotions as courage or cowardice no longer had any meaning for me. This was the end of my apprenticeship, and it was, too, the end of Patricia's private game. Suddenly, the full realization of this truth struck her. Her face no longer expressed either gaiety or curiosity or amusement or anger or sadness. For the very first time, I saw it wrenched into an agony of amazement at the juggernaut march of destiny. It was paralyzed by naked, childish anguish, the anguish of a small girl confronted by a situation which she could no longer arrest or control. She screamed out something in Maasai. I guessed that she was ordering, asking, pleading with Urunga not to come any farther. But Urunga merely shook his spear, raised his shield into the battle position, tossed the tawny skin draped about his top knot, and quickened his pace. I looked round for Kihoro. He was somewhere within gunshot. He had to show himself, and stop this senseless tragedy. I fancied I saw the gleam of a rifle barrel between two bushes, some way away, on the other side of the tract. Was it covering the Moraine's movements? Then the reflection, or whatever it was, disappeared. Urunga was only a few feet from us. A soft, blood-curdling growl vibrated in King's throat, shaking his neck and flanks. His tail began to lash like a flail. He had recognized the scent of the Moraine. It was his enemy he smelled, and this time the enemy carried a shining spear and a great cowhide shield painted in barbaric colors, and above all, a lion's mane. Gently, King, Patricia told him. Keep calm. Listen to me. Listen to what I tell you. Her voice no longer carried a note of command. It was now a desperate plea, because she was afraid, and imploring him to do something. King obeyed. Urunga had halted. He held his shield close against his body, and uttered a strident, piercing howl that seemed to split the sky. "No, King, don't move," Patricia whispered, and again King obeyed her. Orunga drew one shoulder back and raised his arm in the spear-thrower's familiar, unchanging stance. The long, sharp-pointed shaft of gleaming metal hissed through the air. Then, just as the steel bit into King's body, at the very instant when the blood gushed out, Patricia shrieked. It was as though her own flesh had been pierced, and her blood was now spilled. Now she no longer held King in with all her physical strength and willpower, as she had done hitherto. She let him go. She urged him on to the attack. She seemed to catapult him straight at the native warrior. King rose into the air with a light, fantastical, easy spring, and his full weight of shaggy, solid, furious bone and muscle fell roaring on Orunga. The two manes, the living and the dead, mingled and became one. The moraine rolled over on the ground, still protected by his shield, ignoring the vast weight crushing his body and the punishing claws that had already begun to find their mark. He struck out at random with his sword, blindly, frantically. Patricia now ran forward and stood close by them as they rolled over and over, locked close together in mortal combat. She did not realize that it was she herself who had longed for this consummation, who had provoked the antagonist against each other and prepared the ground with such instinctive subtlety and stubborn perseverance. She was aware of one thing only, which blotted out all else. A man had actually dared to raise his spear against King. For this attack he must pay with his life, and even the thought of this death meant less than nothing to her. And so Patricia, nostrils dilated and mouth straining with rage, shouted at the top of her voice, "Kill him, King! Kill him! Kill him!" Already, despite its triple layers of hide, the shield was splitting apart under the impact of those great raking claws, and now a wretched dark-skinned human caterpillar, stripped of its flimsy protective carapace, lay writhing and struggling in the very jaws of death. I shut my eyes, but opened them again almost immediately, as the roar of an internal combustion engine drowned that of the great enraged lion. A whirling cloud of dust sprang up across the savannah, and the Land Rover shot toward us at top speed, with Bullet at the wheel, when he reached a certain thicket a little way off from our tree. He pulled up with a squeal of tortured brakes and got out. From somewhere, Kahoro peered beside him. I could not hear the actual words they exchanged, or get inside their skulls to observe the working of their minds. But there are moments when a few gestures and changes of expression convey both facts and emotions in their entirety. Bullet was unarmed, while Kahoro stood clutching his double-barreled rifle in both hands, and the warden was clearly urging his old tracker to fire, to which Kahoro was, beyond any doubt, objecting that it was impossible to shoot the Maasai while the lion remained on top of him. This ancient, half-blind native had been Patricia's nurse and watchdog since the day she was born. He was a superb tracker, and had found King as a blind, newborn cub, and given him to the little girl to rear, and as a Wakamba, he hated this moraine, both personally and because of his being a Maasai. Because of all these things, it was inconceivable to him that Bullet should be telling him to aim at any other target than Arunga. In all honesty and justice, such a supposition could never have entered his mind. Then Bullet tore the rifle from Kahoro's hands, yet his whole bearing betrayed the fact that he was still uncertain what his next move would be. And then he looked at the man who lay there, pinned to the ground by a murderous wild beast. And though the man was a black, that is to say, a mere nothing, a parcel of worthless flesh wrapped in a skin that was beneath all contempt, and though the black himself had chosen and pursued his present dangerous situation quite deliberately, nevertheless Bullet was pierced to his very marrow by an instinctive feeling of solidarity with him, a basic, incontestable emotion rooted in the first dawn of human awareness. When beast and man met in combat, he had to take the man's side. And in the same split second, Bullet recalled, without knowing it, the legal and personal agreement he had made on accepting his post as warden of the sanctuary. His duty was to protect the animals in all circumstances, except when an animal, any animal, was threatening the life of a human being. So there was no longer any choice for him. He had said it himself, as between the noblest of beasts and the most worthless of men, his obligation was toward the man. Finally, and above all, there rose up in Bullet that primeval urge that he had stifled and suppressed for so long, and which on that account now seized him all the more fiercely, the blood-lust. For years the very thought of it had been forbidden absolutely, but today he had not only the power, but the duty to break the taboo. Bullet could and should, if only for an instant, come back to life, and know again, though it might be but once, the sheer joy of killing. Everything happened simply and quickly. Bullet's right shoulder dipped as though of its own volition, and the rifle seemed to sight its target without human agency. Just as King was about to sink his great fangs into the moraine's exposed neck, a bullet struck him at exactly the right point, behind one shoulder, straight to the heart. The shock of the impact threw him upward and backward, and his roar had more astonishment than anger in it. But even before the sound died away, a second shot tore into him, close behind the first. This was Bullet's famous safety shot, a method of giving the coup de grace which had made the red-headed white hunter famous throughout East Africa. Then suddenly everything was quite still. Under the shade of the spreading, thorny branches lay two motionless bodies, a man and a lion, each crowned with a great leonine mane, and beside them, equally motionless, stood a little girl. Bullet began to run toward them. I joined him halfway and blurted out, "How did you?" Bullet replied without being fully aware that he was talking at all. He said, "I've had that Maasai watched ever since yesterday. One of my rangers followed him. He found your car, commandeered it, and brought me the news. It was pure luck I managed to get here in time. Only then did Bullet realize what he was saying. I knew it because the rifle slipped from his hands, and a ghastly, agonized grimace twisted his features till he looked half-witted. "Pure luck," he repeated. "Pure luck." Slowly his face regained its normal human dimensions. "Pat," he whispered. "Pat, my darling." But Patricia was staring at King. The lion lay on his side, eyes wide open, head pillowed on the grass. He looked as though he were waiting for Patricia to come and lie down against him, as she had done so often in the past. And Patricia, who had not yet learned that even the most wonderful game must end, and the most precious creature die. Patricia now bent over King, and tried to lift that big, protective paw, but the paw now was immeasurably heavy in her hands, and she let it fall again. Then she stretched out a hand toward King's great golden eyes, toward the one that always seemed to be laughing and winking at you. But the lion's blind stare had no meaning now. There was no identity to it. Patricia pressed both hands to her head, as Sybil so often did. "King," she screamed in a terrible voice. "King, wake up!" A kind of glassy film was beginning to form over the lion's eyes. There was already a whole swarm of flies clustering round the dried blood that had formed about the lips of the wounds. Bullet stretched out his huge paw and rested it on Patricia's head. She sprang away at his touch, her face a mask of loathing and horror. "Don't touch me! Don't touch me ever again!" she sobbed. "It was you! You!" Her eyes flickered round for an instant to the still body of King, and at once looked away. "He loved you," she cried. "He played so wonderfully with you the last time out in the savannah." Patricia's voice broke suddenly. It was with such pride that she had declared that day how much Bullet and King looked like two lions together. Then both were hers. Now she had lost first one, then the other. Unhappy, painful tears welled from Patricia's eyes, but she did not know how to cry, and very soon they dried up, and the flow ceased. Her face was burning as though she had a high fever, and in her eyes I could see a mute appeal for help. Bullet took a step toward his daughter, and Patricia ran to Kahoro and flung her arms round his old, crippled body. The old tracker bowed his scarred face over her in silent compassion. Bullet saw it all, and there was such dejection and humility on his face that I feared for his reason. "Pat," he whispered, "darling Pat, I promise you Kahoro will find you another cub. I swear it. We'll get one of King's own litter. And I shall rear it, and it'll become my friend. And then you'll shoot that one too." She spoke each word with merciless, calculated cruelty. At this moment, a hoarse groan came from beneath the tree. It issued from Arunga's lacerated throat. Bullet turned the blood-soaked body over with one quick twist of his foot. The moraine opened his eyes, saw the stricken lion, gave a victorious grin, and at once lost consciousness again. "What's to be done with him?" I asked Bullet. "That's up to his own people," Bullet grunted. "Anyway, he's done for. it makes little odds whether he dies here or outside the manyatta." Patricia stared at Arunga, lying there with his broken, splintered weapons all around him. "At least he showed true bravery," she whispered. Then suddenly she let go of Kahoro and took a step toward Bullet. "And what about your gun?" she said. "You promised never to carry firearms again." "It was Kahoro's," Bullet muttered. Patricia's feverish eyes widened at this, and her lips went white. It was in her secret, still voice that she now said, "So, you were sure of finding Kahoro here, were you? Why?" Bullet hung his head. His lips were trembling, and he was incapable of uttering a single word. "You have always had me followed," Patricia said. Bullet's head hung lower still. "And he obeyed you rather than me," Patricia said. She turned away from Bullet and Kahoro as though they were insubstantial shadows, and bent down over King, her one true friend, the only one who, in his tenderness and strength, had never murdered, never deceived. It was impossible that in a second, while she watched, he should have become blind and deaf, without movement or power of utterance. He had no right to persist in this monstrous, unfeeling indifference. Couldn't he realize she was suffering more for him than she had ever believed was humanly possible? Patricia gripped King's mane in both hands, with savage fury, determined to shake a laugh, or at least an angry growl, out of him. But the lion's head never budged. His throat gaped open inertly, and his stare was fixed and glassy. Only the great swarm of horseflies moved, buzzing round in circles above the clotted, darkening wound. For the first time ever, I saw fear grip Patricia, the fear of the inconceivable and intolerable. She released the lion's mane and instinctively turned up her face toward the sky and sun. Huge black shapes, with bald heads and outspread wings, were circling over King's tree. A faint cry burst from Patricia's lips, terrible in the revelation it expressed. There were no written words in all the world that spoke so eloquently to this little girl as the circles traced by a gathering of vultures. When they assembled in this fashion, it was for one purpose only, to scavenge from some dead animal. This was something Patricia had known from the cradle, and she had seen so many of these corpses, antelope, buffalo, zebra, elephant, and so on, that till this moment nothing could have seemed simpler or more natural to her eyes, or more in accordance with the laws of the bush. A body, a cadaver, that was that. Even Alkalu, even Arunga, but not King. This was not possible for King. He and Patricia loved each other, needed each other. Now he lay stretched out before her in his familiar pose, at once tender, protective, and playful, yet every second he was slipping farther away from her. The essential King was withdrawing, but to where? He was gone already, since the vultures were circling nearer, nearer, eager to devour the omnipotent king of beasts. But to what destination? All the great basic emotions, maternal love, friendship, bloodlust, jealousy, desire, the urge for power. It was through King's meditation that Patricia had learned them all, and now it was, once again, the great lion who had made her aware of the reality of death. With horror-filled eyes, the child stared blindly round for someone to help her face this enormous mystery and horror. All she could see was a stranger, a visitor. He at least had not had the time or opportunity to hurt her yet. "Take me away," she moaned. "Take me away from here. Please take me away." I thought she was referring just to the particular spot where we now stood, but she cried out, "I can't bear to look at my father ever again, or the reserve." I placed my hands as gently as I could on her narrow, stiff little shoulders. "I will do as you wish," I said to her. Then she begged me to take her to Nairobi. "But whereabouts in Nairobi?" I inquired, perplexed. Patricia gave Bullet a sidelong glance, charged with hatred. "The school where I was before," she said coldly. I took this to be a transient fit of temper and revengefulness, which would soon pass off. I was wrong. Chapter 15. We left for Nairobi before the moon was up that night. Patricia insisted on this. The near hysterical passion which she had previously shown for clinging to the reserve she now transferred, with a kind of haunted, speechless vehemence, to the business of leaving it as quickly as possible. The mere thought of spending another night there had thrown the child into such violent convulsions that both her health and reason seemed liable to be endangered, and so, of necessity, she had got her own way. We were going to spend the night in a Nairobi hotel, and the following morning I was to take her back to her former school. Patricia had not let anyone help her pack and get ready for the journey. She herself selected her traveling outfit: a lightweight woolen dress, a tweed jacket, and a round felt hat. She herself ironed and folded the clothes she was taking. There was nothing included that could remind her of her expeditions in the reserve. No overalls or heavy bush shoes. Finally, a small case and a satchel containing her exercise books and school text were placed between us on the back seat of the car, and Bogo set off, with 2 armed rangers sitting beside him. Their job was to escort us to the boundary of the reserve, in case we ran into any danger en route. No previous visitors had ever been allowed to disturb the animals by traveling at night. My bungalow vanished behind us, and soon we were through the native village and out on the main road. Patricia was little more than a small blurred shadow hunched away in her corner. She kept her eyes fixed on the inside of the car, where it was dark. She never stirred a muscle. She hardly seemed to be breathing. It was her silence, more than anything else, which frightened me. I had to make her break out of this intolerable state of tension and solitary withdrawal. Accordingly, I asked her the first question that came into my head. "Why did you refuse even to let your mother come with you?" Patricia answered, through clenched teeth, without moving. "She's got no reason to cry over me. This situation suits her very well." And of course that was quite true. Despite all Sybil's tears and the sorrow she had experienced at the sight of Patricia's suffering. Nevertheless, I was sure that underneath it all, she was as pleased as Punch. Her most deeply cherished plan for her daughter's welfare had at last, against all reasonable expectations, become accomplished. "She still got my father," Patricia went on, in a most unpleasant voice. "She'll have a wonderful time consoling him." That was true, too. Bullet's agony of mind provided Sybil with a wonderful task. Nothing could have suited her better. She at once set about it. While we watched, she looked years younger already. Bullet himself could still count on her devotion, his professional duties, and an unlimited supply of whiskey. But Patricia had nothing left at all. Was it her own fault? And if so, how? She had had a lion. She had had a murrain. All she wanted to do was to make them play a game which her adored father had told her about on so many occasions. The headlights carved their way through the surrounding darkness, illuminating the texture of track and trees and undergrowth. Suddenly, a kind of moving rock barred our path. Bogo jammed on his brakes. The rangers shouted something, and he switched off the headlights. The gigantic elephant, a darker mass against the surrounding night, stood there facing toward us. His trunk was swaying to and fro slowly. He seemed puzzled. "I suppose he's a rogue male, living on his own?" I asked Patricia. She made no reply. She did not so much as glance at the colossal creature. She was denying and rejecting the whole reserve, with all its inhabitants. The elephant shook itself and crashed past us into a tall thicket of thorn bushes. We could hear the undergrowth crackling beneath his feet. Bogo started the car again. Patricia sat there, quite still, her head bent low under its round felt hat. Suddenly she grasped the handle of the door and half opened it, as though she were going to jump out. Her obvious and desperate effort at self-control had come to nothing. She knew we had reached the point where the path that led to King's Tree branched away from the main road. I did nothing to stop her. I was obsessed by the thought of what awaited her in Nairobi. Dormitory and dining hall, the imprisoning ambience of good society. But Patricia, of her own free will, shut the door again and sank back farther than ever into her corner. The only difference was that she'd begun to tremble violently. I stretched out an arm across her little case and tried to clasp her hand. She plunged it deep into the pocket of her coat. The moon was high in the heavens when, in the very middle of the national park, we reached a vast circular stretch of sand, smooth and shining, which had once been covered by a lake. The moonlight made it sparkle all over with glints of silver in endless waves. This lunar mirage stretched right to the base of Kilimanjaro, and in it sported herds of wild animals, drawn by the feeling of spaciousness, by the cool air and moonlit sky. Even the most powerful and unwieldy among them, gnus, giraffes, or buffaloes, moved in a tranquil pattern about this enchanted ring. But the zebras and gazelles and impalas and bush bucks mingled at the very center of this dried-up lake in an endless, gossamer light, insubstantial dance. They were disembodied silhouettes, drawn on the pale silvery night with fine strokes of the brush, like Chinese ink sketches. On the surface of their starry, liquid smooth dancing floor, they glided in line, darting forward, rearing, skimming round with a speed, agility, and gracefulness that even at their most noble and captivating they could never equal in broad daylight. It was a wild, sacred dance, bathed in moonlight, led by moonbeams. Patricia was trembling more and more violently, in ever-quickening spasms. Now it was she who felt for my hand, and grasped it, as though she were drowning. "He is alone," she whispered, "all alone forever." Her first sob was so agonizingly difficult that it seemed like a death rattle. But once the way had been cleared for them, the others followed more easily. Patricia began to weep, as any small child might have wept anywhere in the world, and the beast danced on,